Okay, so here is chapter 6 from book 1. And just as a reminder, what happened in chapter 5 is Monsieur Defarge and Mr. Lorry and Miss Manette climbed up many, many stairs through this little housing development, apartments and small rooms where they found Dr. Manette. And he is clearly very traumatized, and he was busy making shoes in this little tiny garret, this small room where he's been living. So in chapter 6, we're going to see Dr. Manette interact with Monsieur Defarge and Miss Manette and Mr. Lorry. So in this beginning part here, it starts with the white head is bent over making shoes, and Monsieur Defarge greets him. He says, "Good day." And Dr. Manette replies to him, "Good day." And he says, Monsieur Defarge says, "You are still hard at work." And Dr. Manette says, "Yes, I am working." And then there's a very vivid description here of what Dr. Manette looks like. The faintness of the voice was pitiable and dreadful. It was not the faintness of physical weakness, though confinement and hard fare no doubt had their part in it. The deplorable peculiarity was that it was the faintness of solitude and disuse. It says, so sunken and suppressed it was that it was like a voice underground. So there's that motif again of being buried alive, coming from underground. Remember, he's being recalled to life. So he is like a lost creature. He's hopeless. And so this is, PTSD from being in prison for so long. And this is actually a reference to other prisoners during the French Revolution who were known once they were released to be incapable of living a normal life again. And that's the state that Dr. Manette is in. So Monsieur Defarge says he wants to let a little light into the room. And this is a bit of a challenge for Dr. Manette. He says, well, I can bear it if you must let it in. And so they let a little light in, and it shows the workman with an unfinished shoe upon his lap, pausing in his labor. He had a white beard, raggedly cut, but not very long, a hollow face, and exceedingly bright eyes. The hollowness and thinness of his face would have caused them to look large under his yet dark eyebrows and his confused white hair. So this is a physical description that could be asked on a quiz. He's in his mid-40s. I think they say earlier he's 45 years old. So this is not how we would picture a 45-year-old person looking. So clearly being in prison has aged him significantly. He probably looks like he's 60 or something. So I have a note here. There's a very choreographed conversation between Monsieur Defarge and Dr. Manette, which I'm sure is typical of the way Monsieur Defarge would speak to him every day. What are you doing? What kind of shoes are you making? Are you going to finish them today? Just a very simple conversation that would have probably made Dr. Manette comfortable, because it's how they probably in a routine way would interact every day. And then finally, Monsieur Defarge says, "You have a visitor, you see." Well, this is startling. "What did you say?" "Here is a visitor." The shoemaker looked up as before, but without removing a hand from his work. "Come," said Defarge. "Here is monsieur, who knows a well-made shoe when he sees one. Show him that shoe you are working on." So Mr. Lorry takes the shoe in his hand, and Monsieur Defarge says, "What kind of shoe is it? Tell this visitor what kind of shoe it is." And he says, "It's a lady's shoe. It is a young lady's walking shoe. It is the present mode. I never saw the mode. I have had a pattern in my hand." He glanced at the shoe with some little passing touch of pride. So this could be a quiz question. He's making a young lady's walking shoe, which of course makes me think of Miss Manette, his daughter, who was standing there. "Did you ask for my name?" Because Monsieur Defarge says, "And the maker's name," meaning you, Dr. Manette. "Did you ask for my name?" "Assuredly I did." This will be a quiz question. He answers 105 North Tower. So this would have been his number and his identity in prison in the Bastille. Is that all? 105 North Tower. And then Mr. Lorry says, because Mr. Lorry knows that Dr. Manette was a doctor, you are not a shoemaker by trade? And Dr. Manette says, no, I was not a shoemaker by trade. I learned it here. I taught myself. I asked leave to. And then he lapsed away. I asked leave to teach myself, and I got it with much difficulty after a long while. So what he's telling us is that when he was in prison, because he needed something to do, he asked if he could please have some leather and if he could make shoes. And finally, they gave him the tools necessary to make shoes. And when he says, I taught it myself here, he still imagines that he's in prison. Like when he's up in that garret, he thinks this is prison. Like it's just his own reality. It's what he believes. Finally, Dr. Manette, Monsieur Manette, looks at Mr. Lorry, and they lock eyes, and he says, do you remember nothing of me? Look at him, look at me. Is there no old banker, no old business, no old servant, no old time rising in your mind, Monsieur Manette? And so there is a little flicker of recognition gradually forced themselves through the black mist that had fallen on him, a little bit of his intelligence. And so exactly was the expression repeated on the fair young face of her who had crept along the wall, so this is Miss Manette, to a point where she could see him and where she now stood looking at him with hands that at first had only raised in frightened compassion, if not even to keep him off and shut out the sight of him, but which were now extending towards him, trembling with eagerness to lay the spectral face upon her warm young breast and love it back to life and hope. So exactly was the expression repeated, though in stronger characters, on her fair young face, that it looked as though it had passed like a moving light from him to her. So I wrote here syntax, like, oh my God, look at this sentence. This is all one sentence. And the effect of this kind of writing, where it's just like on and on and on, is it creates tension and suspense. It kind of creates this, connection between her and her father that she doesn't want to let go of. It's like very tenuous. So we feel this as a reader. And then the next sentence, darkness had fallen on him in its place. So after all this writing and this connection that Miss Manette is feeling as she looks and moves toward him, darkness falls on him. He looks at the two less and less attentively, so he's pulling away again. And then Defarge says, have you recognized him, monsieur? He's asking this to Mr. Lorry. And Mr. Lorry says, yes. The face I once knew so well, let us draw further back. So it's like he's this wild animal. Like they don't want to spook him. They have to be able to lure him out of this room so they can get him out of France. So what happens in the next couple pages is that Dickens shows us how incredibly melodramatic he can be. This scene with Miss Manette and Monsieur Manette is so overblown dramatic that it's almost kind of laughable a little bit. So what happens is she moves towards him, and like a spirit, she stands beside him, and Mr. Manette gets sight of her skirt. So he's aware there's a woman there, there's somebody there. She has no fear of his striking her with the knife, which is what he's using to make shoes, though Mr. Lorry and Monsieur Defarge are worried about that. So he stared at her with a fearful look, and after a while his lips began to form some words, though no sound proceeded from them. By degrees, in the pauses of his quick and labored breathing, he was heard to say, what is this? So he recognizes her. And with tears streaming down her face, she put her two hands to her lips and kissed them to him, and then clasped them on her breast as if she laid his ruined head there. And her father says, you are not the gaoler's daughter, like the jailer's daughter? And she says, no. Who are you?" So she sits down next to him. He recoiled, but she laid her hand upon his arm. A strange thrill struck him when she did so, and visibly passed over his frame. He laid the knife down softly as he sat staring at her. Her golden hair, which she wore in long curls, had been hurriedly pushed aside and fell down over her neck. Advancing his hand little by little, he took it up and looked at it. So he reaches out and touches her hair. He lays down his work and puts his hand to his neck and takes off a blackened string with a scrap of folded rag attached to it. He opened this carefully on his knee, and it contained a very little quantity of hair. So this could be a quiz question. He has like a little bit of cloth tied around his neck that has hair in it. And he looks at her hair again and looks at the hair in this little packet he has around his neck. And he says, "It is the same. How can it be? When was it? How was it?" And then he explains that his daughter, way back when he had been sent to jail, she had laid her head upon my shoulder that night when I was summoned out. She had a fear at my going, though I had none. And when I had was brought to the North Tower, they found these upon my sleeve. So when he was taken to jail, Miss Manette as a child, like probably a 2-year-old or something like that, a little younger maybe, had hugged him and had left hair on his clothes. And he asks the guards if he can keep those little bits of hair. "They can never help me to escape in the body, though they may in the spirit." Those were the words I said. I remember them very well. So this conversation, look how he's speaking now. I mean, Mr. Manette was having very sort of choreographed, simple language before, but this is like many sentences he remembers so clearly. He formed this speech with his lips many times before he could utter it, but when he did find spoken words, they came to him coherently, though slowly. So that's what's being described here. And then he's like, "Was it you?" And so he's so bold when he says this that Mr. Lorry is alarmed and thinks he should move towards them. And Miss Manette says, "I entreat you, good gentlemen, do not come near us, do not speak, do not move." She is in control of this situation. His hands released her as he uttered this cry and went up to his white hair, which they tore in a frenzy. It died out, so he has like a little fit, as everything about his shoemaking did die out of him, and he refolded his little packet and tried to secure it in his breast, but he still looked at her and gloomily shook his head. "No," he says, "you are too young. It can't be. These are not the hands she knew. This is not the face she knew." So he realizes he looks so old. There's no way this could be his daughter, and he doesn't think she would recognize him. But this whole section here is so dramatic. And so Miss Manette says, "Oh, sir, at another time you shall know my name, who my mother was, and who my father, and how I never knew their hard history. But I cannot tell you at this time, and I cannot tell you here. All that I may tell you here and now is that I pray you to touch me and to bless me. Kiss me, oh my dear, my dear." His cold white head mingled with her radiant hair, which warmed and lighted it as though it were the light of freedom, capitalized, shining on him. And then we have this repetition. She says, "If you hear in my voice," I don't know that it is so, but I hope it is. "If you hear in my voice any resemblance to a voice that once was sweet music in your ears, weep for it, weep for it. If you touch, in touching my hair, anything that recalls a beloved head that lay on your breast, weep for it, weep for it." And she goes on to just describe like their past, and if he remembers it, to weep for it. So she gets him to break down. She held him closer around the neck and rocked him like a child. If when I tell you, dearest dear, that your agony is over, and that I have come here to take you from it, and that we will go to England to be at peace and at rest, I cause you to think of your useful life laid waste, and of our native France, so wicked to you, weep for it. And if when I shall tell you of my name, and of my father who is living, and of my mother who is dead, you learn that I have to kneel to my honored father and implore his pardon, for never for his sake striven all day and lain awake and wept all night, because the love of my poor mother hid his torture from me. Weep for it. So she's telling the story. She didn't know he was alive, and she feels guilty, because if she had known, she would have come to save him. Weep for her, meaning herself. Then, and for me, good gentlemen, thank God, I feel his sacred tears upon my face. So this is just like, she literally causes him to break down. He had sunk in her arms, and his face dropped on her breast, a sight so touching yet so terrible in the tremendous wrong and suffering which had gone before it, that the two beholders covered their faces. So Monsieur Defarge and Mr. Lorry cover their face because they're so moved by this scene. So at this point now, Miss Manette and Dr. Manette are laying in a heap on the floor, basically. And she nestled down with him and holds him. And then she says, if without disturbing, all could be arranged for our leaving Paris at once. And so we have a shift here. Monsieur Manette and Mr. Lorry get very busy because Monsieur Manette is like, yes, he needs to get out of France. The quicker, the better. He has to get papers together, and so that they can actually leave, and they need to have a carriage, and they need to have food and drink so that they can be fine on the road. And obviously, Mr. Manette is a very fragile person to be traveling like this. So Mr. Lorry gets all excited. Oh, this is business. I can do that. This is what he's able to do. And so she sends them off. Miss Manette says, I can take care of him until you return. So she sends the two men to get everything pulled together. And they definitely are able to leave Paris. They get him into a carriage. It says here that Mr. Manette is very agreeable. In the submissive way of one long accustomed to obey under coercion, he ate and drank what they gave him to eat and drink, and put on the cloak and other wrappings that they gave him to wear. And he definitely followed Miss Manette and got into the carriage like he was told to do. So she's used to this. It's interesting. It says here, he had no recollection of his ever being brought from the prison to the house. He didn't know that he was actually in a different place. They heard him mutter 105 North Tower, and when he looked about him, evidently it was for the strong fortress walls which had been encompassing him. He's confused when he leaves this little room. He's thinking he's supposed to be in the prison. There was no crowd about the door. No people were discernible at any of the many windows. Not even a chance passerby was in the street. An unnatural silence and desertion reigned there. Only one soul was to be seen, and that was Madame Defarge, who leaned against the doorpost knitting, and saw nothing. So this is repeated. Dickens, I'm sure you figured out, does a lot of repetition here to create drama and suspense. And throughout this, she's watching this whole ordeal, getting him into this carriage, but it keeps saying that she saw nothing, which is ironic. We know she sees everything, but she looks like she sees nothing. To the barrier, which means take us to the border. We need to get to the boat. We need to get out of the city. So to the barrier would be to leave Paris. There's probably checkpoints as you leave. And they go through a checkpoint, and all the paperwork is fine, and they are sent on. And it says, all through the cold and restless interval until dawn, they once more whispered in the ears of Mr. Jarvis Lorry, sitting opposite the buried man who had been dug out, and wondering what subtle powers were forever lost to him, and what were capable of restoration and old inquiry. So these are the thoughts Mr. Lorry's having. They're on this journey now back to Calais to sort of, take the boat and then go back to Dover and retrace their steps. And he's hearing these conversations in his head again, Mr. Lorry is. I hope you care to be recalled to life. The old answer, I can't say. He's just replaying in his head, like, is Mr. Manette going to want to be free again? And then it says the end of the first book. So Mr. Lorry and Miss Manette have succeeded in getting Dr. Manette out of France.